My name is Christopher Wiley. I'm a data scientist and the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. I was originally hired to be the director of research at a company called SCL Group. SCL Group was a British military contractor, and they focused on conducting research and operations for the British and American militaries that utilize psychological operations, information operations, to, in many cases, identify and combat extremism or infiltrate terrorist groups, or understand how certain terrorist groups recruit or why they're effective in certain regions in the world. And I originally got hired because when you look at organizations like ISIS, for example, a lot of their operations are organized online. So you had the American military or the British military sort of ironically falling behind a very sort of rough and ready terrorist organization that was using forums and chat groups and apps on phones. The research that I started doing at the company was focused on how to identify who in a particular population, whether that's a domestic population or a foreign population, is most vulnerable to being recruited or manipulated by an extremist organization, so that you can intervene and prevent people from being recruited in the first place, or for people who already are working in an extremist organization, identify the kinds of messaging that you can target them with to either make them quit or to create less cultural cohesiveness in that organization, to make them less good at what they do.
When you first started with SCL, what was your intention? What was it that you wanted to do?
The research that they were doing appealed to me because it was, first of all, really interesting. You get to study lots of different cultures and interesting problems that otherwise you don't necessarily encounter every day as a data scientist. From the military's perspective, you have two options. If you're looking at an organization like ISIS, you can either go send in a drone and shoot a missile and blow them up and kill them, or you can interfere with the effectiveness of their recruiting. You can interfere with the effectiveness of their communications. You can interfere with the cohesiveness of their cultural and social bonds that they have within the organization, so that they're less good at what they do. And starting from that approach, it means that you can combat terrorism in a way that has less chance of collateral or at least what we thought would have less chance of collateral damage, compared to a drone strike. The sort of irony of it is that the collateral damage of this research actually turns out to be quite substantive, because it then got acquired and then reused on an American population or in Britain, and the result was Donald Trump or Brexit. The problem really started when Robert Mercer, who is the billionaire who bought the company, when he installed Steve Bannon to become in charge of the company. And Steve Bannon had very particular ideas as to why this company should how it should be used and what its purpose was. And Steve Bannon wanted to fight a culture war. And in order to fight a culture war, or any war, right, you need an arsenal of weaponry. And if your war happens on a cultural plane, the types of weapons that you need to develop are informational. And so the reason why he wanted to work for the company was simply that it had built things that were weapons. They were just weapons that you use online. They're weapons that you use to deceive or to manipulate or to coerce people using information, to identify certain people who are more prone to believing certain things and target them with manipulative information. And that was the technology that he wanted to use for his culture war.
Why was it, do you think, that Steve Bannon wanted to sort of engage in this cultural war?
Because he has a warped idea of how the world should be. He has particular views on race. He has particular views on the sort of role of strong men as leaders, or what he would call strong men. He has very sort of authoritarian views on how a country should be run. And, you know, when you have these, what at the time were fringe ideas, in order to get them mainstreamed, you have to get creative in how you, present them and inject those ideas into the population. He had the benefit of having the resources of a billionaire, which means that he had at the disposal, millions and millions and millions of dollars, which means that he could go identify a company like SCL, buy it, and then reuse it to start a campaign.
You were with them for how long? Like, did you say?
2 years.
2 years.
Yeah.
During the course of the 2 years, which point did you start to feel uncomfortable, and why was it that you started to feel that way?
It was after Steve Bannon took over that a lot of the research that we were doing started to be repurposed, and then also the directives and priorities of the company started to shift. I questioned the rationale as to why we would, for example, need to understand how to provoke more racialized thinking in an American population in an offensive way, not in a we're trying to sort of de-radicalize, but or de-racialize people's thinking. The opposite, radicalize and racialize people's thinking. That I found really problematic, particularly when I started to watch some of the videos that they had of some of the lab experiments and the focus groups that they were doing, where ordinary people would come in, and by the end of these experiments, people would be shouting racist slogans as if it was completely normal. And I went and I challenged some of the leadership, the new leadership of the company, and saying this has no purpose, right? This has no purpose. If the point of this company is what it used to be, this has no purpose. And they decided to continue doing that kind of research, and that's when I left. This wasn't in the United States, this was in Africa, but it just shows you the mindset, how bad the company got. They were sending out videos in one particular African country of people being burned alive, tied up and burned alive, or having their throats cut in order to intimidate and threaten voters so that they wouldn't go and vote in an election. Threatening them, like if you show up, this might be you. You might do that if you're trying to prevent people from going to some kind of recruitment center, in an extremist organization or a terrorist organization. And so you might create some kind of threats to prevent them from even going and speaking to that recruiter. In that case, you're doing that so that they don't go and join an organization, which will then eventually put a suicide vest on and go and blow up, a church or a mall, right? In this situation, you're denying people the right to vote through a threat. And so looking at some of the stuff that they were doing, not just in the United States, but in other countries, was so repulsive that I could not, in good conscience, continue at that company. The stuff in the United States is what gets the most attention because it has to do with the American election. Obviously, the consequence of Trump is huge on a geopolitical scale. But it wasn't just the stuff that they were doing in the United States that I found upsetting. Some of the most disgusting things I've ever seen came out of that company, and it was literally videos of people bleeding to death in a ditch with the most insidious, demonic narratives of people threatening the viewer. And then these would be put out online so that voters would see that and not want to go and vote. And the thing that I found so offensive also is that the attitude of the company was, well, it's Africa, so we can do whatever we want. That these people aren't even worthy of considering, being considered humans.
Had you decided to stay, with all these doubts in mind, had you decided to stay, what would you have been doing?
Had I continued with Cambridge Analytica, I would have been complicit in helping build Steve Bannon's movement off the back of like racism, working with hostile foreign powers to undermine American society. Like none of that I in good conscience could have done.
What was your reaction to the result of the 2016 presidential election?
It was surreal for me to watch that happen. What at the time people said were sort of bizarre narratives that Trump was talking about, whether it was build the wall or drain the swamp, or talking about the deep states and the government taking things from you and spying on you and all that. These were all things that I distinctly remember coming out of some of the research that Cambridge Analytica was doing very early on. And those were put into reports that then went to Steve Bannon, who then would, give that to Donald Trump. And so watching American news was really weird for me, because they would be laughing at what he was saying, or, this guy sounds like he's insane, or how, like, there's no possible way that this guy could win saying this random stuff. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, actually, that's not necessarily true. Just, you don't realize how many people can be led to support these kinds of things if they're targeted in the right way. And the more you make fun of this guy, Donald Trump, the more you're actually making fun of the audience that goes, I like what I hear. And every time they make fun of him, they're making fun of me as the audience, and that solidifies support. Boom, he gets elected. And then everyone freaks out. I found that almost traumatizing, I think is probably a word to use, because it was, like I couldn't do anything about it.
What did you feel like you've created?
Not to use a cliche, but it does sort of feel like, Frankenstein in a way, where you are researching something and you're interested in what it is that you're researching, and then it goes in a direction that you didn't imagine it would possibly go, and then you've realized you've created literally a monster. He weirdly became Donald Trump because of this research. And so it sort of became infused into who he was and what he stood for. Donald Trump was sort of molded like clay by Steve Bannon into sort of his ideal candidate. And a lot of that had to do with the research and data that was collected by this company. And that's, hard to sort of watch.
Were you scared?
I wouldn't say that I was scared, but like I had already been threatened many times by this company. They had sued me lots of times. This is a company that is creating a monumental impact on the world in a way that for me is like the antithesis of my ethics. That's when I felt like I needed to, talk to somebody about it, despite the fact that they were threatening me nonstop. And it was around that time that The Guardian, which is a newspaper in Britain, got in touch with me and, asked if I wanted to share information about what that campaign was doing and what Cambridge Analytica was doing. And so it was only a couple months after he got elected that then I started my journey as first becoming an anonymous whistleblower and then later becoming a named source in their reporting.